Why would you write SQL queries manually in Microsoft Access? Hi, I'm Philip from codekabinett.com. I was just in the process of recording another video about subqueries in Access, and then I kind of digressed a little bit further, and well, here we are. I thought I would make my digression into a video on its own, and it's about writing SQL manually, and not really in Microsoft Access, but for Microsoft Access. Well, why would you do that? There are a couple of reasons, and the first and strongest reason is you want to use subqueries, because you theoretically can use subqueries in the graphical query designer, but even then you would need to write the subquery manually by typing in the SQL text. And if you already need to write the subquery expression manually, then it makes more sense, in my opinion, to write the whole query manually in, well, not in Access, but in a suitable text editor, because actually the Microsoft Access SQL editor is a bit lacking, to be very friendly in that regard. Well, another reason to write SQL manually in a text editor is simply for managing the complexity. The graphical query analyzer, the query designer, is actually quite good in Access. For simple queries, I like to use that. If you just put in a couple of tables there, drag the joins between the tables if they aren't recognized automatically, then type in a few criteria down there in the expression columns at the bottom of the graphical query designer, then it's all fine. And there's no real reason to use manually written SQL. But sometimes you have a very complex query with multiple joins and joins between tables that are not straightforward. It's not just one table joined to the other, and you might have a subquery in there for enhanced complexity, and well, up from a certain point, I think it is much more digestible to read the SQL in text form. It certainly depends on your experience with SQL, but as sometimes you need to embed SQL code into your VBA programming, then you would have to deal with raw SQL anyway. So it is definitely a skill you should possess. I'm not saying you should write all queries manually. That would certainly be overdoing it, but some queries are definitely easier to manage in raw SQL in a text editor. And so that is what this video is about. We are looking at a couple of examples, and I'm going to bring up one more topic that is particularly interesting when writing queries by hand. That's aliases in SQL. An alias is just an alternative name for an expression, a column, or a table. And that is really essential if you got a calculation, some sort of expression that is calculating something in your query. I mentioned that a couple of times. You should always use a meaningful name for that expression in the output list, because otherwise Microsoft Access would assign a default name to that, and that is expression 1001 or something like that, and counting up from 1 to 3 to whatever, how many expression you are using. And that is a maintenance nightmare, because if you just look at the column list, you have no idea which is what. And so you should assign a meaningful name to each expression, and you do that by using an alias. And you can also use aliases in SQL to kind of overwrite the original name of columns or tables. And that is quite helpful if you write SQL manually, because then you do not need to type the full table name if you reference a particular table. You can just abbreviate that with an alias, and that is actually a situation where I would recommend to use very short aliases. I usually use 1 or 2 letter aliases for table names, because you look at the SQL and see the context and the meaning of that very short alias immediately. Okay, enough of an introduction. We go to the screen and look at some SQL statements. You are probably familiar with the graphical query designer in Microsoft Access. It usually looks like this. You got your table here, you can drag down columns down here and write expressions down here. That is how you usually would design your queries. But you can always switch to a different view by using the view command here, and you can go to SQL view. And then you will encounter something like this. And that is the raw SQL behind the query. And Access will always be able to generate SQL code from your query. It will most of the time not look as nicely formatted as this, but the SQL code is always there, and you can always go in here and change things like this one. Just define an alias here. I'm going to talk about aliases in a minute. And now you can run this query, and you see I've got renamed that column, and you can switch back to the graphical design view, and this is reflected here as well. So this is always a two-directional editor. You can change stuff in here. If I just rename that to ABC and switch to the SQL view again, then you will see that has been automatically transferred to the SQL view and represents my change there. So this is bidirectional. You can edit the query in either view and switch to the other, and will automatically have the results there. Well, but the Access SQL designer, the Access SQL editor, this window here is actually not very nice to use. So I usually use a different tool for that. It is a bit of a nuisance because I have to manually copy the text of the query and paste it in here. This is Notepad++, the text editor I mentioned. That is a very, very useful tool for all sorts of text editing tasks. Now I can switch the language to SQL and get some basic syntax highlighting here. And I've got a very nice plugin. Just quickly look at the first line here, because that is going to change. I've got a nice plugin here. It's the poor man's T-SQL formatter, and I need to select all that text and go here and say format T-SQL code, and now I get this on different lines and nicely indented subquery in here, and that automatically formats my SQL in a much more readable fashion. So I actually prefer to edit more complex queries. If I need to write the SQL, I prefer to do that in Notepad++. While we're talking about editing comfort and readability of SQL, I would like to digress a little bit further. I mentioned earlier that it is really important to get these table qualifiers for the columns right, especially here where there is a customer ID in the customer table and another customer ID in the order table. And to correctly identify each customer ID, you need to write the table name, but that is a bit of a nuisance to always write the table name, and I think it's not really ideal for readability. So I would like to introduce you to another concept in SQL. It's the alias. I already did that with this statement, the as last banana order date. That is when I gave a name to that column that had no name yet. And I can use the same technique to give a different name to existing items in my query. I can rename existing columns. I could write customer number here. So then this would show up as customer number in the query. That does not make too much sense in this particular case, but I can also alias table names, and that makes a lot of sense. So I can go here to table customer and say as C. And then I can reference the table customer by the letter C anywhere in this statement. And actually I not only can reference it with the letter C, but I have to, because now this is not, TBL customer is not a valid name outside of this expression. And the from clause is a very basic expression of the query. So everything that is derived on the from clause will not know the TBL customer anymore, but it will only know C. So I have to rewrite this as C.customer ID and C.customer name. And here I need to write C.customer ID. And this saves me a lot of typing, but I think it makes the table much more readable, because you focus on the customer ID, and only once you have seen, yeah, this is a customer ID column of which table, when you ask of which table, then you see the C, and in most queries it's pretty obvious what that is. You got the nice highlighting in Notepad++ here already, but even if you would not have that, you would easily see the C as an alias for the customer table. And I usually just use single letters, because most of the time you will have a SQL statement on screen. You will see the whole SQL statement. Even if you have to scroll up and down a little bit, it's probably fairly easy to go to the from clause and look at the table name for C to see what that actually is. So there is a little detail about the as keyword in the alias definition. By the definition in the SQL standard, the as keyword is optional. So I could delete the as and the statement should work anyway. Now, Microsoft Access is a little bit peculiar here. while it accepts my alias for the table name here without the as keyword, it insists on the as keyword as a column for the column alias. And that has led to me being a little bit inconsistent here, because I actually would prefer to leave the as out and do not write it. So I would always just put in a letter or column name after the expression to name it with an alias. But as Access insists on the as, I kind of got used to that, and I use the as expression for column names, but I don't use it for the alias of table names. And for consistency, I will write the as right now in this tutorial video, but if you come across other SQL statements I wrote, you probably might notice that I just omit the as keyword for table aliases. Okay, let's clean up this statement a little bit more, because we can use the alias system some more for these tables here. I always use very short abbreviations with a single letter or two, maybe three letters if it's a long name, but usually not more than that. And now I will insert these aliases in here to make this all more readable. And we could be even a little bit clearer here and just add the alias here to clarify from which table we select the order date. Now that we reworked that whole SQL statement, we can just copy it back into the Access query window. And you see the SQL editor in Access is not even able to display tabs. So my nicely indented SQL is just left aligned here and lost quite a bit of its readability. But I'm not bothered by that right now. I just want to run this query. And you see the query runs. It has the same results as before, but the SQL is much more readable. Maybe not inside the Access editor, but I can always go back. I just pretend I did not have it in here and paste it, and then you see the lost tabs reappear. But even if you had another query in Access, I go to a random other query, just go to Design View, to SQL View, and you see this is pretty unreadable. That's the SQL the Access query editor automatically generated. If I go in here, paste it in here, and then use the nice poor man's T-SQL formatter, then it will be formatted much nicer. And if I select the correct language, I will have a bit of syntax highlighting as well. Well, that's it already. I said we are going to look at some SQL statements. That was not entirely true, it was just one, but I think it's enough, because you have seen the basic idea of using a text editor, ideally combined with some sort of SQL formatter, and I'm going to put the links to the Notepad++ text editor and the poor man's T-SQL formatter into the description of the video. And yeah, by that way you can quite easily manage the stupidity, sorry for that, of the SQL editor in Access. And that is actually quite helpful if you need to write complex SQL queries by hand. Well, I think That's all for today. Thank you for watching and bye for now.